Message collapsed. He sent the invitation himself. That was the part no one could quite believe. That Damian Cross had personally addressed the envelope, sealed it with his own hand, and dropped it in the mail with a satisfied smirk on his face. Not because he wanted to celebrate anything, not out of kindness or nostalgia or even basic decency. He sent it because he wanted her to see him, wanted Vivian to walk into that wedding, his wedding, and understand once and for all that he had moved on, moved up, and left her exactly where she deserved to be, behind him. He never imagined she would respond with an invitation of her own. If you've ever wondered what it looks like when a man's entire self-image collapses in real time, stay with this story. Because what happened the afternoon Damian Cross walked through those iron gates is something that doesn't happen in movies. It happens in real life, to real people who spent too long believing their own press. Drop a comment right now and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I read every single one, and I want to know how far this story has traveled. Hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and don't go anywhere. This one is worth every minute. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, slipped between a credit card statement and a dry cleaning receipt, and Damian almost missed it entirely. He almost wished he had. The envelope was cream-colored, heavy stock, the kind that costs more per sheet than most people spend on lunch. His name was written in clean, unfussy calligraphy. Not the overwrought scrolling kind that tried too hard, just precise and confident and completely unbothered. There was no return address. Only a small embossed crest in the upper left corner that Damian didn't recognize but filed away as probably meaning something. He opened it standing at his kitchen counter, still in his gym clothes, protein shake sweating on the marble beside him. Mr. Damian Cross is cordially invited to celebrate the marriage of Vivian Ann Hart and Adrian James Blackwell, Harrowfield Estate, Greenwich, Connecticut. Saturday, the 14th. Dress, black tie. He read it twice. Then he set it down, picked up his shake, and stood there for a long moment staring at the window above the sink. Vivian was getting married. He turned that fact over in his mind the way you'd turn over a stone, checking what lived underneath it. He expected to feel something, jealousy, maybe, or that particular sting of pride that comes when an ex moves on before you've fully decided they're allowed to. But what he actually felt, if he was being honest with himself, was something closer to relief. Maybe even amusement. Good for her, he thought. Good for Vivian. He'd been carrying a low-grade guilt about the divorce for almost 3 years. Not enough guilt to lose sleep over, but enough that it surfaced sometimes in quiet moments. The kind of guilt that had more to do with optics than actual regret. He hadn't been cruel, technically. He'd simply stopped pretending. Stopped pretending the marriage was working. Stopped pretending he was happy. Stopped pretending that the quiet, competent woman he'd married at 31 was still the right fit for the man he was becoming at 38. He'd told her that. More or less. He'd said something about growing in different directions, about needing a partner who matched his energy, about life being too short for comfortable mediocrity. Vivian had listened to the whole speech without crying, which had unsettled him more than tears would have. She'd simply said, "All right, Damian," and gone to make coffee, and that had been more or less the end of 7 years. He'd expected her to fall apart. That wasn't cruelty. It was just logic. She'd built her entire adult life around their marriage, their home, their shared routines. She didn't have a career to speak of, just a middle management logistics position she'd treated like a hobby. She had friends, sure, but not the kind who came with connections or resources. She was, in the kindest possible framing, ordinary. He'd been surprised, in the months after the divorce, that she hadn't called more, hadn't shown up somewhere embarrassing, hadn't sent long emails or mutual friends with worried faces to check on him. She had simply disappeared into whatever smaller life she was now living. And now she was marrying someone named Adrian Blackwell. Damian set the invitation on the counter and Googled the name. The search results loaded fast. He stared at the screen for a moment, then put the phone face down on the marble and finished his protein shake. He told himself he wasn't going for the wrong reasons. He told himself this several times over the following 2 weeks. In the car, in the shower, once out loud to his reflection in the bathroom mirror of his midtown apartment. He was going because it was the mature thing to do. Because showing up demonstrated confidence. Because disappearing would imply he had something to be afraid of. And Damian Cross was not afraid of anything, least of all his quiet ex-wife marrying some industrialist from a world she'd never had any business entering. He was also going because Cassandra thought they should. Cassandra Reeve was 29, and she looked exactly like what Damian had decided he deserved after his marriage ended. She was sharp-featured and photogenic, worked in fashion PR, and had a talent for walking into rooms in a way that made people pay attention. She was not particularly warm. She was not, if Damien was being honest, especially easy to spend long stretches of time with. But she was impressive in ways that were immediately visible, which had mattered enormously to him when they'd started dating 18 months ago. "We're going," Cassandra said when he showed her the invitation. She was eating a salad with the focused efficiency she brought to everything. "Obviously we're going. I thought you might say that. You showed it to me, didn't you?" She speared a cherry tomato. "You want to go, you just need someone to make it feel like a reasonable decision." That was one of the things he both admired and resented about Cassandra. She was accurate in inconvenient ways. "I'm curious," he said. "That's all." "You want to see what she looks like," Cassandra said. "And you want her to see what you look like, standing next to me." She said it without vanity, just as a statement of fact. "Which is fine, Damien. Just be honest about it." He was not, in fact, particularly honest about it, but he confirmed the RSVP that evening. They drove out to Greenwich on a Saturday morning that was almost aggressively beautiful. Clear sky, autumn trees just beginning to turn, the kind of New England weather that made everything look more significant than it probably was. Cassandra wore a black gown that had cost more than Damien's first car, and she looked extraordinary in it, and he noticed her noticing that he noticed. The address took them off the main road and down a private lane edged with old oaks whose roots had lifted the asphalt in places, giving the impression of a path that had existed long before anyone thought to pave it. The lane opened, after about half a mile, onto a gravel forecourt the size of a small parking lot, and beyond that, Damien stopped the car. Beyond the forecourt was Harrowfield Estate. He'd looked it up, of course. 14,000 square feet of original Georgian architecture, built in the 1880s, privately held for decades, recently renovated and still occupied, not as a hotel or an event venue, but as an actual home. 60 acres of grounds, including formal gardens, a private lake, and what the listing had described, in the dry language of real estate, as ancillary structures. What the listing had not prepared him for was the sheer physical reality of the place, the way it sat against the tree line with the settled, unapologetic weight of something that had never needed to prove it belonged. The windows were lit even in afternoon light, warm against the stone facade. On the south lawn, white tent structures had been erected that were less like wedding tents and more like temporary architecture, glass-sided, internally illuminated, connected by covered walkways lined with what appeared to be living hedges and brass planters. There were valets at the gate, not young men in generic uniforms, actual valets in crisp black, moving with the organized efficiency of a well-run operation. One of them appeared at Damien's window before he'd fully processed where to park. "Mr. Cross?" the man said, checking a tablet. "That's right. Welcome to Harrowfield. If you'll leave the vehicle here, we'll take care of it." A pause. "I hope you had a pleasant drive from the city." Damien got out of the car. He stood in the forecourt and looked at the estate and the tents and the guests moving across the grounds in black tie and evening gowns, and he felt the first faint edge of something he didn't have a name for yet. Cassandra appeared at his side. She was looking at the estate with an expression he hadn't seen on her face before, something careful and recalibrated, like a professional appraiser suddenly aware they may have underquoted a property. "Damien," she said quietly. "Yeah." "Who is this man she's marrying?" "I told you, he's in industrials, manufacturing, global logistics." He said it the way you say something you've researched but not fully absorbed. "And this is his house." "Apparently." Cassandra took a slow breath. "Right," she said, and walked toward the entrance, and Damien followed her, because there was nothing else to do, sad. The first person he recognized was Marcus Webb. Marcus had been a mid-level VP at a shipping conglomerate when Damien had crossed paths with him at a conference 4 years ago. Pleasant enough, ambitious, the kind of man who remembered names and follow-up emails. Damien had always filed him away as someone moderately useful. Marcus was standing near the entrance of the main tent with a drink in his hand and a name badge that read, Blackwell Global, Senior Director of Operations. He spotted Damien and smiled the careful smile of a man who is surprised but unwilling to show it. "Damien Cross," Marcus said. "I didn't know you and Vivian were still in touch." "Old friends," Damien said, which was not technically a lie. "Of course." Marcus glanced toward the interior of the tent. "She's remarkable, isn't she? What she's built over the last 2 years, I mean, most people in this room have been watching it happen and still can't quite believe it." Damien smiled in the way you smile when you don't know what someone is talking about, but are unwilling to admit it. She's always been impressive, he said. Marcus laughed, not unkindly, but with a quality that Damien didn't like. I'll say. The supply chain restructuring alone saved Blackwell Global somewhere north of 40 million in the first 18 months. Adrian calls her the best hire he almost didn't make. He shook his head. Funny how things work out. He moved away to greet someone else, and Damien stood with Cassandra in the entrance of the tent and looked out at the crowd. It was not the crowd he'd been expecting. He'd imagined, in the weeks leading up to this, something manageable. A wedding with good catering and well-dressed guests, and the quiet, satisfied air of a woman who had done reasonably well for herself. He'd imagined feeling generous. He'd imagined Vivian catching his eye across the room and something passing between them, acknowledgement, maybe, of the life they'd shared, and the polite mutual agreement that they'd both landed somewhere fine. What he had not imagined was this. The tent was full of people whose names he recognized from financial news and industry publications. He spotted the CFO of a major aerospace contractor talking to a woman he was almost certain had recently been appointed to a federal trade committee. There were faces he recognized from technology, not startup money, but the older, quieter, institutional kind. A man who had restructured 2 failing rail companies was apparently telling a story that was making everyone around him laugh. Near the bar, a former U.S. trade ambassador was deep in conversation with someone Damien didn't recognize but whose entire posture communicated net worth in the 8-figure range. These were not wedding guests. These were people who ran things. Damien? Cassandra's voice was low and very controlled. Why are these people here? They must know Adrian. Some of them, maybe. She was watching the room with the professional attention of someone whose entire career existed in the architecture of social signaling. But look at how they're grouped. Those clusters near the center, they're not business casual. They're not catching up about golf. She paused. They're here because of her, aren't they? Damien didn't answer. I was looking at the far end of the tent, where the ceremony space had been arranged. A simple arch of pale flowers against the glass back wall, a string quartet seated to the left, chairs arranged in measured rows. And at the edge of that space, speaking with 3 men who had the particular composure of people who manage very large sums of money, was Vivian. He almost didn't recognize her. Not because she'd changed dramatically. She hadn't, not in the ways he'd half expected. She hadn't lost 40 pounds or dyed her hair or surgically altered anything. She was still Vivian, same dark eyes, same way of holding her shoulders, same slight tilt of her head when she was listening closely to something. But she was wearing it all differently now. The gown was understated in the way that very expensive things often are. Ivory silk, clean lines, nothing that shouted. Her hair was up, simple. She wore small diamond earrings and nothing else. And she was standing with those 3 men, one of whom Damien belatedly recognized as the regional director of a major private equity firm, with the complete unperformed ease of someone who had been in that exact room, having that exact conversation 100 times before. She was not performing confidence. She simply had it. One of the men said something and she laughed, a real laugh, not the social kind, and put her hand briefly on his arm, and the man looked pleased in the way people look when someone whose opinion matters has acknowledged them. Damien felt the unnamed thing sharpen into something recognizable. It was disorientation, the specific dislocating vertigo of a world that has rearranged itself while you weren't watching. He'd come here expecting to find Vivian rebuilt. He'd been prepared for that, even prepared to be magnanimous about it, to nod approvingly at whatever modest life she'd assembled and feel the quiet relief of someone who had made the right call. He had not been prepared to find her here, in this room, with these people, in this dress, wearing that expression, laughing that laugh. Damien. Cassandra had taken his arm and her grip was slightly tighter than necessary. I need a drink. Yeah, he said. Me too. They found seats near the middle of the ceremony section, close enough to see but not conspicuous. Cassandra positioned herself with the automatic precision of someone who understood sight lines, and Damien sat beside her and tried to arrange his face into something that looked like uncomplicated, supportive presence. The ceremony was brief by the standards of the room. 20 minutes, a justice of the peace, simple vows in plain language. No theatrical declarations, no choreographed moments. Vivian and Adrian stood facing each other with the gravity of 2 people who had thought carefully about what they were doing, and Damien found, to his irritation, that he couldn't look away. Adrian Blackwell was not what he'd pictured. He'd Googled the man, of course, had seen the professional photographs, tall, silver-haired, the distinguished but capable look of old money that had stayed active. In person, he was both more and less than the photographs suggested. More weathered, with the kind of face that had absorbed a few decades of actual difficulty. Less polished, in the way that genuinely powerful people sometimes are. He wasn't performing wealth, he just inhabited it, the way you inhabit a house you grew up in. And the way he looked at Vivian. Damien had been married to her for 7 years. He knew her face. He'd watched it across hundreds of dinners, and through dozens of arguments, and in the particular stillness of early mornings when she thought he was still asleep. He knew the specific quality of her attention, the way she gave it fully when she was engaged and withheld it, not unkindly, just honestly, when she wasn't. She was giving Adrian her full attention, and he was giving her his. It wasn't the performative adoration of people who needed an audience. It was something quieter and more uncomfortable to witness. The specific ease of two people who had decided, after sufficient evidence, that they could trust each other. Damien looked at his hands, hooked him. The reception opened onto the south lawn through the glass back wall, which turned out to be a series of folding panels that withdrew entirely, converting the tent into an open pavilion. The lawn beyond had been lit with what looked like thousands of small, warm lights strung between temporary poles. And a second, larger tent had been revealed, this one for dining, set with round tables, and what Damien slowly identified as centerpieces that had probably cost more individually than his monthly car payment. There was a jazz quartet playing something low and complicated near the bar. There were past appetizers that Damien ate without tasting. There was Cassandra at his side, doing what she did brilliantly, working the room, smiling, drawing people in, filing away names and faces with the practiced efficiency of someone whose professional survival depended on exactly that. He watched her do it and felt, for the first time, slightly superfluous. He got a drink. Scotch. Neat. Something from a bottle he didn't recognize, but that tasted like it had been aged longer than most of his relationships. He stood near the edge of the lawn and looked out at the party and tried to locate the version of this evening that he'd planned for. It wasn't there. A woman appeared beside him. Late 50s, sharply dressed, the kind of posture that came from decades of boardrooms. She introduced herself as Helen Chow, a name he vaguely recognized from supply chain publications, and said she was an old friend of Vivian's from before. Before what? Damien asked. Before Blackwell Global. Helen looked out at the lawn. We were at Meridian Freight together, years ago. She was the smartest person in any room she walked into. But you know how those places are? Mid-market logistics. Mostly men, the kind of culture that mistakes loudness for competence. She shook her head. She saw things nobody else saw. Wrote a restructuring proposal that would have saved the company about $12 million in annual operating costs. They thanked her for her contribution and filed it away. What happened to the company? Went under, Helen said pleasantly. 4 years later, the restructuring she'd proposed might have saved it. She sipped her drink. She left before that, fortunately. Damien was quiet for a moment. She never mentioned that. Helen looked at him with a polite, measuring expression. Didn't she? A pause. Well, she's not the type to make a production of being underestimated. She just moves forward. She smiled, and it was entirely genuine, and somehow that made it worse. It was lovely to meet you, Damien. She walked away, and Damien stood at the edge of Adrian Blackwell's lawn and drank his scotch and tried to remember if Vivian had ever talked about Meridian Freight. She had. He was almost certain she had. He had a hazy memory of her saying something over dinner once. Something about a project, about feeling dismissed, about a proposal she'd worked on for 3 months. He remembered nodding. He remembered refilling his glass. He remembered not asking any follow-up questions because he'd had a difficult week and hadn't had the bandwidth for someone else's workplace frustrations. He remembered thinking, somewhere in the private architecture of his own assumptions, that it probably hadn't been that important. That if it had been truly significant, it would have been more obvious. He had another drink. At some point in the early evening, he found himself near a cluster of men he didn't know, and one of them, introduced as Owen Park, a logistics consultant with an academic background, was in the middle of a story about a conference he'd attended 2 years ago in Singapore. She presented for 40 minutes without notes, Owen was saying, with the particular animation of someone recounting something that had genuinely impressed them. The entire hall. And this is not a room that gives standing ovations. These are analysts and logistics executives, professional skeptics, completely silent. You could hear the air conditioning, And at the end, she took questions for another 30 minutes and answered every single one without hedging, without deflecting, without the PR speak you usually get from someone at that level. What was the topic? Someone asked. Predictive freight modeling using port congestion data, Owen said. She had rebuilt the entire methodology from scratch. The paper she published afterward has been cited by 3 separate industry working groups. He shook his head. I've been in this field for 25 years. I've heard a lot of presentations. That was something different. Damien drank his drink. The paper. The conference in Singapore. The 40 minutes without notes. He tried to calculate how long ago Vivian had left their marriage. 37 months. Just over 3 years. And in those 3 years, she had published papers, presented at international conferences, restructured a global logistics network, become someone that men like Owen Park told stories about at weddings. He tried to calculate when that version of her had started forming, and the math kept coming out wrong, because it kept suggesting she'd been becoming this person long before the divorce. Long before she'd stood in his kitchen saying, "All right, Damien," and going to make coffee. Long before he'd told her she was the wrong fit for the man he was becoming. The lawn lights were very bright against the dark of the trees. The jazz quartet had moved into something slower. Near the main table, visible through a gap in the crowd, Vivian was dancing with Adrian, not the careful, self-conscious dancing of people performing for a room, but the easy, slightly imperfect dancing of 2 people who were comfortable enough together to be slightly bad at it. Damien watched, and somewhere in the expensive dark of Harrowfield Estate, with a drink in his hand and Cassandra somewhere behind him navigating a room that had stopped requiring his navigation, Damien Cross began to understand, in the dull and specific way of someone who has arrived very late to a conclusion that has been waiting for them, that he had gotten something profoundly and irreversibly wrong. He just hadn't figured out the full shape of it yet. That would come later. The dancing had stopped, but the music hadn't. That was the thing Damien kept noticing, how the evening kept moving, kept generating its own momentum, indifferent to the fact that he had quietly come apart somewhere between his second and third scotch. The jazz quartet cycled through another number. Servers materialized and disappeared with fresh glasses and small plates of food that cost more per bite than he wanted to calculate. Guests laughed and moved and clustered and separated with the organic ease of people who were genuinely glad to be there, and Damien stood at the edge of all of it like a man watching a film he'd arrived too late to fully follow. Cassandra found him near the bar. She had the look she got when she'd been working a room and had gathered more intelligence than she'd expected. It wasn't excitement exactly. Cassandra was too controlled for excitement, but there was a particular sharpness to her eyes that he recognized. "Come with me," she said quietly, and took his arm without waiting for his answer. She steered him toward the far end of the pavilion, away from the densest clusters of guests, to a spot near the edge of the lawn where the string lights thinned out and the noise dropped to something manageable. She stopped and turned to face him with the direct, undecorated expression she used when she was about to say something he wasn't going to enjoy. "Tell me honestly," she said. "What did you know about what she'd been doing since the divorce?" "Not much," he said. "We didn't keep in touch." "Did you know she was at Blackwell Global?" "I knew she was in logistics. I didn't know—" "Did you know she was a senior executive?" He said nothing. Cassandra looked at him for a moment with something that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite contempt, but lived in the uncomfortable territory between them. "I've been talking to people for the last hour," she said. "Not about her specifically, just listening, the way you do. And her name keeps coming up. Not because she married Adrian Blackwell, because of what she did before she married him." She paused. "She restructured their entire North American freight operation, cut something like $42 million in annual costs. That number came up 3 separate times from 3 different people who had no reason to coordinate. I heard something similar from someone earlier." "Then you've heard it enough to take it seriously." Cassandra glanced toward the interior of the tent, where Vivian was visible at a distance, talking with a group near the head table. "The man by the bar, the one in the gray jacket, he runs a freight intelligence firm based out of Chicago. He told me she presented a demand forecasting model at a conference last year that essentially rewrote the standard methodology for mid-market logistics planning. She said it carefully, like she was reading from a document. He said people in his field will be teaching it in 5 years. Damien took a slow breath. "She's not just successful, Damien." Cassandra said it without inflection. "She's significant. There's a difference." He knew the difference. He'd spent his entire adult life pursuing one and occasionally achieving the other, and he knew exactly where the line was. "I should get some air," he said. "We're outside," Cassandra pointed out. More air then. She let him go without argument, which told him she understood he needed a minute, or possibly understood that she needed one too, to recalibrate whatever calculations she'd been running since they'd pulled into the forecourt and seen the estate for the first time. He walked the perimeter of the lawn slowly, hands in his pockets, the way you walk when you're trying to look like you're simply enjoying the evening rather than actively reassembling your understanding of the last 3 years. The lights overhead moved slightly in a breeze he could barely feel. Somewhere across the grounds, past the formal gardens, he could see the glint of the private lake, still and dark and unreflective. He passed a group of women he didn't know who were talking about a board appointment. He passed 2 men discussing port infrastructure in Southeast Asia. He passed a table where someone was explaining, with the patience of someone who'd explained it many times, the specific regulatory differences between logistics frameworks in the EU and the Gulf states. Every conversation he drifted near had weight to it, the specific gravity of people who dealt in large numbers and real consequences. He reached the edge of the garden and stopped. He was thinking about the Caldwell Group contract. He hadn't let himself think about it directly in weeks, the way you don't let yourself look directly at something that might be worse than you're prepared for. The Caldwell Group had been his company's largest single client, a 5-year contract for operational consulting services that had represented nearly 30% of Cross-Strategic's annual revenue. 3 weeks ago, his COO had called him with the news that Caldwell had declined to renew. No formal explanation, just the standard language about strategic realignment and evolving needs and gratitude for the partnership. He'd been furious. He'd called Caldwell's procurement office and been transferred 3 times before reaching a junior associate who'd said the decision had come from above her pay grade. He'd drafted a letter to Caldwell's CEO that his lawyer had wisely talked him out of sending. He'd spent 2 weeks telling himself it was politics, or a personality conflict somewhere in the chain, or just the random bad luck that occasionally hit even well-run operations. He had not, until this exact moment standing at the edge of Adrian Blackwell's garden, considered the possibility that the decision had originated with Vivian. The thought arrived quietly, without drama, and sat in his chest like a stone. He turned it over. The Caldwell Group was a Blackwell Global client. He'd known that, in the abstract, distantly. Blackwell Global's reach was extensive enough that they touched most major freight-dependent operations in the country. The procurement decisions of Caldwell's logistics partners would flow through Blackwell's infrastructure planning division, which Vivian ran. He stood there in the garden and did the arithmetic. The contract renewal review would have crossed her desk, or a desk near hers, or a report that passed through her office bearing his company's name, Cross-Strategic Consulting, and its record of performance over the last 4 years, which had been, he forced himself to be honest, not especially distinguished. The last 2 years in particular had been difficult. He'd lost 2 senior analysts to a competitor, had taken on a client in the energy sector that had consumed enormous resources and delivered mediocre results, had restructured internally in ways that had created as many problems as they'd solved. The renewal review would have included performance metrics, delivery timelines, cost efficiency, client satisfaction data. It would not have looked good, and Vivian would have seen his name on it. He stood in the garden for a long time, listening to the distant sounds of the reception, and tried to decide what he felt about this. He cycled through anger first, because anger was familiar and immediately available. Then something more complicated, the specific, uncomfortable sensation of recognizing that you may have received exactly what you deserved, delivered by the last person you'd expected. He walked back toward the pavilion. Boom. The dinner service had begun, and the crowd had migrated mostly to the dining tent. Damien found his place card. He and Cassandra had been seated at a table near the middle, which was neither an honor nor a slight, just a logistical placement that told him nothing about what Vivian thought of his presence here. The table had 8 people. He recognized none of them at first glance. They introduced themselves with the easy, abbreviated efficiency of people used to professional settings: names, companies, a sentence of context. To his left was a man named Gerald Park, no relation to Owen, who was the chief operating officer of a freight technology startup that had recently closed a significant Series B. Across from him was a woman named Sandra Ewan, who described herself as a supply chain architect with an unhelpful vagueness that Damien suspected concealed something impressive. Gerald poured wine for the table with the automatic generosity of someone raised to do it, and conversation started the way it does at well-matched tables, overlapping, self-correcting, finding its level. At some point, Damien's company came up. Not conspicuously. It surfaced the way things do in industry circles, through the specific gravitational pull of a name that's been recently in circulation for a particular reason. Cross-strategic, Sandra said, with the neutral, thoughtful look of someone pulling up a file. Consulting, right? I feel like I've seen something about them recently. That's my company, Damien said. A brief pause at the table. Not uncomfortable, just the slight recalibration of a conversation that has acquired new information. Good operation, Gerald said, in the tone people use when they're being kind rather than accurate. Have you worked with Caldwell? We did, Damien said. Contract ended recently. Gerald nodded once, carefully. Strategic realignment, he said. Something like that. Another brief pause. Gerald poured more wine. Sandra asked someone else a question, and the conversation moved, the way conversations do when the table has collectively decided not to press something. But Damien had caught it, the specific texture of Gerald's response, the too careful nod. The phrase strategic realignment delivered with the tone of someone who knows the actual reason and is choosing not to say it. After dinner, when the table had loosened and people were drifting in various directions, Damien leaned toward Gerald with the directness of someone who had stopped having the patience for indirection. You know why Caldwell dropped us, he said. It wasn't a question. Gerald looked at him for a moment, and to his credit, he didn't pretend. I heard something, he said. From who? Gerald picked up his wine glass and set it down again. The review came out of Blackwell's infrastructure division. I know someone in Caldwell's procurement chain. Word travels. He looked at Damien steadily. It wasn't personal. That's what I heard. Pure performance review. Your numbers over the last 2 years didn't justify renewal against the available alternatives. And who signed off on that recommendation? Gerald said nothing for a moment. Who signed off on it? Damien said again, quieter. I don't know for certain, Gerald said, but I'd imagine anyone with oversight of Blackwell's client logistics relationships would have been involved in that chain. He paused. I'm sorry, Damien, for whatever it's worth. Damien nodded and thanked him and excused himself from the table. He found the bar and stood at it for a few minutes without ordering anything, just existing in the specific white noise of an open bar at a wedding reception, ice and glass and the low murmur of people in various states of comfortable loosening. You look like a man doing math, said a voice beside him. He turned. It was a woman he hadn't met. Early 60s, compact and direct, with the silver-streaked hair of someone who had stopped pretending it was a problem some years ago. She had a glass of sparkling water and no particular agenda in her expression. Sorry, he said, just thinking. About what? She said it with the ease of someone who'd earned the right to ask direct questions and had decided to use it. About whether I understand a situation I thought I understood, he said. She nodded, as if that were a perfectly sensible answer. How long did you work with Vivian? She asked. He looked at her. I'm not psychic, she said. You've been watching her all evening, and you have the specific look of someone who knew her when. She extended her hand. Rosalind Marsh, I'm on the Blackwell Global Advisory Board. I've known Vivian for about 2 years. Damien Cross. Rosalind didn't react to the name in any visible way, which told him she either didn't know who he was or had very good manners. What was she like? He said, before he decided to say it. When you first met her. Rosalind considered. Contained, she said after a moment. In the way that people are when they've spent a long time being underestimated and have decided to stop arguing about it. She had, still has, this quality of just getting on with things, not in a cold way. She's not cold, but she doesn't spend energy on performances. She doesn't need the room to acknowledge what she's done. Rosalind tilted her head slightly. In a room full of people who are very comfortable performing their own competence, that's either invisible or extraordinary. With Vivian, it turned out to be extraordinary. When did people start noticing? When she fixed the Singapore corridor, Rosalind said it matter-of-factly. Blackwell Global had a persistent bottleneck in trans-Pacific freight routing. Been a problem for years, multiple consultants, significant money spent, no real resolution. She looked at it for 6 weeks and proposed a rerouting and carrier partnership structure that cleared it. Fully implemented inside 5 months. A pause. Adrian noticed before anyone else, honestly. He's good at that, recognizing capability before it announces itself. Damien looked out at the room. Vivian was visible across the tent, standing now with Adrian's hand at the small of her back, both of them talking to a couple Damien didn't recognize. She was laughing at something. The laugh was real. She never seemed ambitious, he said. He hadn't meant to say it either. Rosalind looked at him with a polite and very precise sharpness. I wonder, she said, if that's because she wasn't, or because nobody was asking. She excused herself pleasantly, and Damien was left at the bar with the specific residue of a conversation that had said more than it appeared to. It was Cassandra who found the thread he should have found himself. She appeared at his elbow around 9 o'clock with her phone angled slightly toward him. Not rudely, just deliberately. She'd been searching, he could tell. The focused, methodical way she'd been working the room all evening had apparently migrated to her phone. "Look at this," she said. He looked. It was a trade publication profile, 18 months old based on the date, titled The Quiet Restructuring: How Vivian Hart Rebuilt Blackwell Global's North American Spine. Below it was a photograph of Vivian at a desk that was not ostentatious but clearly occupied by someone with authority. Papers, 2 monitors, the particular organized density of a workspace that was actually used. He read the first few paragraphs. The language was the dry, precise language of industry journalism, but even through that filter, the picture assembled itself clearly. The scope of what she'd done, the speed, the measurable outcomes. Revenue impact in the hundreds of millions. Carrier partnerships renegotiated, legacy contracts restructured, an entire logistics architecture modernized in less than 2 years. "She was doing this," Cassandra said quietly, "while you thought she was rebuilding." He handed the phone back. "I know," he said. "Do you?" Cassandra looked at him with the expression she used when she wanted to say something important and was deciding how directly to say it. "Because I've been at this party for 4 hours, Damien, and I've talked to maybe 20 people, and your name has come up twice. Hers has come up in almost every conversation." She paused. "I'm not saying that to be unkind." "I know," he said again. "Your company," she said carefully. "The Caldwell contract." He looked at her. "I heard about it," she said. "At dinner, from Sandra. She didn't know that we were—" She stopped and started again. "She said the review came out of Blackwell's infrastructure division, that the performance data was clear, and the recommendation was made on merit." Another pause. "She said the executive who signed the final recommendation was Vivian." The music from the jazz quartet floated through the tent, soft and unhurried. Around them, the reception continued its easy, wealthy momentum. Somewhere near the head table, Adrian Blackwell was shaking hands with someone and laughing at something and looking, from a distance, like a man who was exactly where he intended to be. Damien Cross stood next to the woman he was supposed to marry in 3 months, and felt the shape of his situation become, for the first time, completely clear. He had come here to watch Vivian see what she'd lost. He had arrived instead to discover that she'd lost nothing, that the years since their divorce had been, for her, not a period of rebuilding at all, but of unfolding, of finally having sufficient room to become the full size of what she'd always been. The marriage he'd ended because she wasn't matching his trajectory had been, he now understood with the cold precision of genuine reckoning, the thing that had been limiting hers. He had not outgrown her. He had been standing in front of the light. And the Caldwell contract, 30% of his annual revenue, gone because of a performance review that had crossed her desk and been found wanting, was not revenge. He understood that too, in the hollow, reluctant way you understand something you'd prefer not to. It was just a business decision, made by someone who was very good at her job, who had looked at his numbers without sentiment and drawn the only reasonable conclusion. He had not been cut. He had been assessed. "Cassandra," he said. "Yeah?" "I need a minute." She nodded once. "I'm going to get another drink," she said, and walked toward the bar, and her posture was very straight, and he noticed, in a distant way, that she was recalculating too. What she was doing here, who she was standing next to, what the geometry of this evening said about the man she'd agreed to marry. He didn't follow her. He stood in the middle of a tent full of people who knew Vivian's name, at her wedding, in the house of the man she'd chosen, and breathed the warm evening air, and let the full weight of what he hadn't understood settle onto him the way heavy things settle. Not all at once, but gradually, the way the ground absorbs water. He thought about the dinner conversation years ago that he couldn't fully remember. The proposal she'd worked on for 3 months that he'd half listened to. The conference in Singapore that must have happened sometime in the last year of their marriage, or just after. He wasn't sure anymore. And whether she'd mentioned it. Whether she'd tried to tell him something and he'd nodded and refilled his glass. He thought about saying, "I'm growing in a different direction," to a woman who had been quietly building the direction he couldn't follow. He thought about the word ordinary and how confidently he'd held it and how completely it had been wrong. Across the tent, Vivian caught his eye. Not by accident. She was looking at him directly, the way she'd always looked at things she'd decided to look at, fully, without flinching, with the calm of someone who had nothing to prove to the person looking back. She nodded, once. Acknowledgement without warmth, without coldness. Just recognition. The specific look of someone who sees you clearly and has decided you no longer require any particular emotional response. He nodded back. She looked away. And Damien Cross stood in the middle of that expensive, indifferent room and understood that he had already lost something he hadn't known he was in the game to keep, and that she had known it long before he had, and had simply, quietly, gotten on with things. The nod she'd given him across the tent had been worse than being ignored. That was what Damien kept turning over as the evening moved deeper into itself. That brief, untroubled acknowledgement. The way she'd looked at him and looked away without anything in her face shifting. No satisfaction, no discomfort, no residue of feeling in either direction. Just recognition and dismissal, clean as a door closing. He'd been cataloged and filed and moved past in about 3 seconds, and she was already back in conversation before he'd fully registered that it had happened. He'd spent the better part of an hour trying to locate some alternative interpretation of that look, some reading that put him in a more bearable position. He'd come up with nothing. Cassandra had not returned from the bar. He'd found her eventually, near the east side of the pavilion, deep in conversation with a man he didn't know. Early 40s, confident posture, the particular ease of someone who moved through expensive rooms without having to think about it. They were talking about something that was making Cassandra laugh in the unguarded way she rarely laughed around Damien. He'd watched that for a moment from a distance, and then turned away because the full accounting of the evening didn't need another entry. He got another drink. His fourth, or possibly his fifth. He'd lost count somewhere around the time Rosalind Marsh had asked him whether Vivian's lack of visible ambition had been her limitation or his. He nursed the scotch slowly now, trying to stay on the right side of the line between loosened and sloppy. Because whatever happened in the next few hours, he needed to be functional enough to drive home with his dignity in some form of working condition. How was not, he was realizing, going to achieve that. The problem with arriving at genuine understanding in the middle of someone else's wedding reception was that there was nowhere for the understanding to go. He couldn't leave. That felt like surrender in a way he wasn't quite ready for. He couldn't stay and pretend to enjoy himself. He'd exhausted his capacity for that performance an hour ago. He couldn't talk to anyone, because every conversation he'd had since the ceremony had added weight rather than removed it, and he didn't have the architecture for any more honest information tonight. He needed to talk to Vivian. The moment he let that thought surface, he recognized it as a bad idea with the same part of his brain that also recognized he was going to do it anyway. He watched her for 20 minutes first, not from closeness, just from the natural vantage of someone moving slowly around a large reception space. Vivian moved through the evening with the same quality she'd always had, which was a specific kind of unhurried presence. She didn't rush between conversations. She didn't work the room in the transactional way of someone collecting contacts. She stayed with people long enough for conversations to become actual exchanges rather than performances. And then she moved on, and the people she left always had the look of someone who'd received something worth keeping. He'd never fully noticed that about her. He was noticing it now. Adrian kept a loose orbit around her, close enough to be together, far enough to give her full room. Damien watched that dynamic with a kind of painful attention to detail. It wasn't the anxious hovering of a man who needed to own the space his partner occupied. It wasn't the theatrical demonstration of a couple performing happiness for an audience. It was just presence. The easy gravitational pull of two people who had decided to be in the same room and meant it. He'd been a different kind of husband, more demanding in the ways that made you feel less free. Not cruel, he'd always told himself, not controlling, just directive. He'd had clear ideas about how things should be organized, how evenings should go, what a partnership was supposed to look like, and Vivian had accommodated all of it with a patience he'd mistaken for contentment. He was accumulating a long list of things he'd mistaken. Around 10 o'clock, he saw Vivian step outside, not toward the main entrance, toward the side garden, through a set of glass doors that opened off the dining tent onto a narrow terrace that ran along the estate's east wing. She had a glass of water rather than champagne. She was alone, and she had the look of someone who'd decided, briefly, to be. He should have stayed inside. He went outside. The terrace was lit by a single strand of lights along the railing, giving everything a warm, slightly amber cast that would have been romantic under different circumstances. Beyond the railing, the garden fell away into organized darkness. Boxwood hedges, the distant shape of ornamental trees, the faint smell of something that might have been late-blooming roses, or might have been the evening air off the lake. Vivian heard him before she turned. She had always had good spatial awareness. She'd once told him she could map a room from sound alone, something he'd found mildly interesting and then immediately forgotten. She turned. Her expression didn't change. It stayed exactly as it had been. The expression of someone who'd stepped outside for a moment of quiet and had just had that moment interrupted. "Damien," she said. "Hey." He winced internally at that. "Hey." He'd had 4 scotches and apparently reverted to 23. "Are you enjoying the evening?" The question was genuine rather than barbed. That was somehow worse. She actually wanted to know if he'd had a decent time. "It's a beautiful wedding," he said, which was true. "Thank you." She looked out toward the garden for a moment and then back at him. She was giving him the patience she'd always given him, the willingness to wait for people to get to what they actually meant. He'd forgotten she did that. He took a breath. "I need to ask you something," he said. Something shifted in her posture. Not defensiveness, just the slight adjustment of someone preparing to deal with a thing they'd known was coming. "All right," she said, "the Caldwell contract." A pause. "My company lost it 3 weeks ago," he said. 30% of our annual revenue. No explanation given. I've been trying to figure out where the call came from." He watched her face. "It came from you, didn't it?" Vivian held her water glass in both hands and looked at him with the steady, unhurried attention that he now understood was not passivity, but a kind of precision. "The recommendation came through our infrastructure planning division," she said. "I reviewed it. I approved it." There it was. "Why?" he said. She looked at it, though he'd asked why the sky was a particular color. "Because Cross-Strategic's performance over the contract term didn't meet renewal standards," she said. 2 missed delivery benchmarks in the last 18 months. Client satisfaction scores below threshold in 3 consecutive quarterly reviews. The operational cost efficiency analysis came in 22% below the market alternative. She said it without heat, without apology. It was a straightforward assessment. "You didn't think to mention." "Mention what?" She said it quietly, but there was a fine edge in it. "That your company was underperforming a contract held with one of our clients? That I was going to recommend non-renewal based on the data?" She tilted her head slightly. "Would that have been professional, Damien?" He opened his mouth and closed it again. "I made a business decision," she said, "based on performance, not on history." "You had to know what it would mean for the company." "I knew what the data showed," she said. "Your company had been declining for 2 years before this review. That's not a Caldwell problem. That's a structural problem. The contract ending didn't cause that." She paused. "It just made it visible. It landed the way accurate things land when you've been avoiding them. Not as a blow exactly, but as a sudden clarity that made everything ache." "So it wasn't revenge," he said. He was testing the word, seeing how it fit. "No," she said flatly. "It wasn't." "You never thought about it that way. Not once." She looked at him for a long moment. The string lights on the railing threw soft amber shadows across her face, and she looked tired, he realized. Not of the evening, of the conversation, of being the person required to explain this to him. "Damien," she said, "I moved to Connecticut 2.5 years ago. I built something. I worked more hours than I'd worked in my entire life, and I was genuinely happy doing it, which was not something I had experienced in a very long time." She paused. "I didn't spend that time thinking about you." He heard it, felt the specific gravity of it. "That's not unkind," she added, and she meant it. It wasn't unkind, it was just true. And her tone made that distinction clear. "It's just accurate. You weren't in the picture. The work was in the picture. Getting better at something I was good at was in the picture." She looked down at her water glass. "The Caldwell review was just work. Your name on the file meant exactly what anyone else's name would have meant." "You must have felt something," he said, "seeing my name on it." She considered that. She always considered things before she answered, he was remembering. She'd never been someone who spoke before she'd formed the actual thought. "I felt," she said carefully, "that I hoped you'd built something sustainable. That was all." Another pause. "I don't hate you, Damien. I don't feel anything that strong. I haven't for a while. What do you feel?" He asked it without intending to. It was the scotch and the evening and the cumulative weight of every conversation since he'd walked through those iron gates. She looked at him directly. "Honestly?" She said it not as a rhetorical opener, but as an actual question, checking whether he wanted the real answer. "Yeah," he said. "Honestly." "Not much," she said. I feel like I'm talking to someone I used to know. The version of you I knew is very far away, and I don't mean that as an insult. I mean that I've changed enough that even the version of me who was married to you feels like someone else. She looked toward the garden. I don't carry the marriage around with me. I don't carry the divorce. It happened, and then I went forward, and I'm very glad I went forward, and that's genuinely all there is. He stood on that terrace in the October air and tried to locate something to say that wasn't simply an expression of everything he'd misunderstood and couldn't find it. I thought you'd struggle, he said finally. He said it because he owed her something honest, since she'd been honest with him. After the divorce, I thought, you'd built everything around the marriage. I thought without it you'd fall apart. Her voice was level. I didn't think you'd... He stopped. I underestimated you. Yes, she said. You did. Not bitter, not satisfied, just confirmed. I'm sorry for that. She looked at him for a moment. I know, she said. Not it's okay, not thank you, just acknowledgement, clean and complete. I also owe you an apology for the way... He started. Damien. She said it gently but finally. You don't have to do this tonight. I want to. I understand. She looked at him with the patience that was, he now understood, not the patience of someone who needed him to finish. It was the patience of someone who could wait for as long as it took because none of it had the power to hurt her anymore. But I'm going to go back inside. It's my wedding. And you came here tonight for a reason that I don't think turned out the way you expected. And I hope it's been... She paused, searching for the right word. Useful, she said. I hope it's been useful. She moved past him toward the glass doors. Vivian. She turned. I'm glad you're happy, he said. He meant it. It was the first completely uncomplicated thing he'd said all evening. Something moved in her expression. The briefest acknowledgement of something old and real. Not tenderness, not warmth, but the recognition of a person who was telling the truth and deserved to have it received. I know you are, she said. Take care of yourself, Damien. And then she was back inside, moving through the warmth and the light of her own party, and he stood on the terrace in the dark and the October air and breathed. He stayed outside for longer than he intended. When he came back in through the glass doors, the reception had moved deeper into its late hours, looser, louder, the formal architecture of the dinner service giving way to the more organic movement of an evening that had found its own momentum. A small number of guests had migrated to the lawn outside the main tent, where someone had started a low fire in a copper pit, and the silhouettes of people gathered around it had the relaxed geometry of people who'd stopped performing and started actually enjoying themselves. He went looking for Cassandra. He found her at a corner table with the same man she'd been talking to earlier. Their heads were close together over what appeared to be something on his phone. A business proposal, or possibly a series of photographs, or possibly something else entirely. She looked up when Damien appeared, and the flicker of guilt in her expression was too brief to be called guilt, but too present to be called nothing. Hey, she said. Hey. He looked at the man. I don't think we've met. This is Fletcher Cole, Cassandra said. He's in private equity. He knows Adrian from... She stopped. It doesn't matter. Fletcher, this is Damien Cross. Fletcher Cole was precisely the kind of man Damien had always been somewhat competitive around. Younger by a few years, the particular self-possession of someone who'd made serious money early enough to stop being impressed by it. He shook Damien's hand with the easy warmth of someone who wasn't threatened, which was its own kind of threat. Good to meet you, Fletcher said. He looked between Cassandra and Damien with the slight, careful expression of someone who had correctly read a situation and was deciding whether it was his to navigate. I'll grab a drink, he said. Give you two a minute. He left without waiting for anyone to tell him it was necessary or unnecessary, which meant he was paying attention. Damien sat down across from Cassandra. She looked at him with the expression she wore when she was assembling something she wanted to say in the right order. How did it go? She said. Outside. How did you know I was outside? I saw you follow her out. He nodded. I needed to ask her about Caldwell. And? She confirmed it. He looked at the table. It was a business decision, performance data. She wasn't wrong. Cassandra was quiet for a moment. Damien, the company's been struggling, he said. It came out easier than he'd expected, maybe because he'd been carrying it quietly for months, and the evening had stripped his capacity for pretending. The last 2 years were bad. He stopped. I made some decisions that didn't work out. I know, Cassandra said. He looked at her. I've known, she said, with the directness she always used when she decided to stop being diplomatic. For a while. You don't talk about it, but the numbers, you leave things open on your laptop, Damien. I see the projections. She held his gaze. I didn't say anything because I thought you'd bring it up when you were ready. He looked at her across the table in the amber light of Adrian Blackwell's dining tent and tried to locate the version of the last 18 months where this had been a relationship built on genuine honesty and mutual understanding, and couldn't find it. What he found instead was two people who'd been separately pretending the scaffolding was structural when it had been decorative for a long time. Fletcher, he said. She didn't flinch. He's interesting. He seems to be. I'm not, she started, then stopped herself from whatever softening she'd been about to offer. I don't know what tonight is, she said honestly. I came here expecting one kind of evening, and it turned into something else, and I need some time to think about what that means. For us. For a lot of things, she said. Not cruel, just true. He nodded. I can call a car, he said, if you'd rather stay. She looked at him for a long moment, weighing something, or finishing a calculation she'd started earlier in the evening. I think that might be better, she said quietly. If you don't mind. He did mind, actually. Not out of love, or even out of jealousy exactly, but out of the profound indignity of a man who had arrived at this wedding intending to demonstrate his success and was leaving it alone, his largest client gone, his fiancée staying behind for a younger man with more money, in the house of his ex-wife's billionaire husband, having been told with complete and unhostile clarity that he had been, in all the ways that mattered, a person who wasted what he had. But dignity, he was learning tonight, was not always available in the form you'd prefer. Sometimes you took what was left. I'll get my jacket, he said. He spent 10 minutes looking for the coat check, which had been moved from its original location to a smaller anteroom off the main entrance, and spent those 10 minutes aware of every face he passed and whether anyone was watching him with the particular attention of someone who knew the texture of what he was walking through. Most people weren't watching him at all. He was, as Vivian had said, irrelevant to their evening. He found his jacket. He stood in the small anteroom while a young woman in Harrowfield's serving uniform retrieved it, and he buttoned it in the mirror hung beside the coat rack and looked at himself for a moment. He looked tired. He looked like someone who had driven out to Connecticut with a specific story about who he was and had spent 4 hours having it systematically dismantled. He looked, honestly, like a man who had needed this evening for a long time and would spend the next several months wishing it hadn't been necessary. He tipped the coat check attendant too much because he didn't know what else to do with his hands, and walked out through the main entrance of Harrowfield Estate into the October night. The forecourt was quieter now. A few valets at their station, the warm sound of the reception drifting from the tents behind him, the crunch of gravel under his shoes as he walked toward the end of the forecourt where cars were waiting. The air was cold in the way of New England autumn. Not harsh, just unambiguous, like a statement of fact. He was waiting for his car when he heard a door open behind him. He turned, expecting another guest stepping out for air, and found instead the last person he'd expected to see, Adrian Blackwell. He came through the side entrance of the main building, not the formal front doors but a narrower entrance off the east wing, and he was alone, jacket off, the top button of his shirt open, with the look of a man who'd stepped away from his own party for precisely the same reason people do. He saw Damien and stopped. The two men looked at each other in the forecourt with the October air between them. Damien had no framework for this encounter. He'd spent the entire evening constructing and dismantling versions of how this night would go, and none of them had included standing in the forecourt of Harrowfield Estate facing Adrian Blackwell without a script. Mr. Cross, Adrian said. It wasn't warm, and it wasn't hostile. It was measured. The tone of a man who processed information before assigning emotion to it. Mr. Blackwell. Damien nodded once. Congratulations. Thank you for coming. A pause. He meant it, Damien realized. There was no irony in it. She's remarkable, Damien said. He said it because it was true. And because standing in this forecourt, it was the only thing he had to offer that was entirely without calculation. Adrian looked at him for a moment. Something moved in his expression. Not softness exactly, but the slight shift of a man who had been prepared for something more combative and was recalibrating. Yes, Adrian said simply. She is. The valet appeared with Damien's car. The moment dissolved. Damien walked to his car and opened the door. Behind him, Adrian Blackwell stood in the forecourt of his own estate and watched him go with the even, patient expression of a man who had built enough to know when something wasn't worth the energy. Damien drove down the long lane with the old oaks on either side, their roots lifting the asphalt, the darkness closing in as the estate fell away behind him. The string lights of the tents were just visible above the tree line in his rear-view mirror for a few seconds before a curve in the road took them away entirely. He drove in silence. He had no music for this. Nothing fit. The radio came on by default when he started the car, and he turned it off immediately, because the wrong song in the wrong moment was more than he could take. And what was left was just the sound of the engine and the road and the quiet, particular darkness of Connecticut between exits. And somewhere behind him a party full of people who moved in a world he'd thought he understood. The dashboard clock read 11:47. He thought about what the drive home had looked like in his head this morning, how different the silence had been in his imagination, satisfied rather than hollowed, the quiet of a man who'd made his point and was returning to the life that proved it. He'd driven out here to let Vivian see what she'd given up. He drove home understanding that she'd given up nothing and that the accounting of the evening had been entirely about him. His phone lit up on the passenger seat. A message from Cassandra. Just 2 words, no punctuation, drive safe. He read it at a stoplight. He put the phone face down and drove. He got home at midnight to an apartment that felt, for the first time, like it belonged to someone else. That wasn't a new sensation exactly. He'd felt versions of it before, usually after trips. The mild alienation of returning to a space that had existed without you and hadn't especially noticed. But this was different. This was the feeling of walking through a door and understanding, in the specific, irreversible way of genuine reckoning, that the person who'd left that morning no longer quite fit the life arranged inside it. He didn't turn on many lights, just the kitchen, enough to see by. He poured water, drank it standing at the counter, and looked at the apartment the way you look at a balance sheet when you suspect the numbers aren't going to add up. The place was good, objectively good. Midtown address, high floor, the kind of finishes that photographed well and communicated a specific income bracket to anyone who walked through the door. He'd chosen it after the divorce with the deliberate intention of choosing something that would communicate exactly those things. He'd furnished it to match. Everything in it said successful man, and he'd been comfortable with that story for 3 years. Standing at his kitchen counter at 12:30 in the morning, he was aware that the story had a significant gap in it, and the gap had been there the whole time. He went to bed eventually. He didn't sleep well. He lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and ran through the evening in the way you run through something that has cost you more than you budgeted for, trying to find the entries that don't belong. There weren't any. Every entry belonged. Sunday arrived gray and indifferent. He made coffee and sat at his kitchen table with his laptop open to Cross Strategic's most recent operational report, and looked at the numbers with the specific, exhausted honesty of someone who has stopped having the energy to read them charitably. It was not good reading. He'd known the company was struggling, had known it for the better part of 18 months, in the way you know something when you've been managing it as a problem to be handled rather than a reality to be addressed. The Caldwell contract loss had crystallized what the numbers had been suggesting for a while. Cross Strategic had been running on momentum and reputation for 2 years, and both were wearing thin. The energy sector client, the one that had consumed enormous resources and delivered mediocre results, had quietly declined to expand their engagement 3 months ago. 2 of his senior analysts had left for a competitor 18 months back, and the replacements he'd hired had been cheaper and less experienced, which had saved money in the short term and cost significantly more in client satisfaction over the following year. His COO, a capable but increasingly frustrated woman named Patricia, had brought him a restructuring proposal 6 months ago that he'd reviewed, approved in principle, and then failed to implement because implementation required admitting the problems were structural rather than temporary. He scrolled through the report. Patricia's proposal was still in his email, dated April, marked as actioned when it had not in fact been actioned. He opened it. He read it for the first time with the actual attention it deserved rather than the cursory attention of a man who'd been certain things would turn around on their own. It was, he had to admit, a good proposal, detailed, realistic, with a clear-eyed assessment of the company's weaknesses and a phased approach to addressing them. She'd recommended reducing the client roster to focus on fewer, higher-value relationships. She'd recommended investing in 2 senior hires rather than 3 junior ones. She'd recommended a systematic client satisfaction review process that would catch deterioration before it showed up in contract renewal decisions. She'd recommended all of this in April, and he'd thanked her and said he'd circle back, and then he had not circled back. He closed the laptop. He showered, dressed, and went to the office. Not because there was anything specific that needed doing on a Sunday morning, but because he needed to be in a room that was about the problem rather than sitting in his apartment being about himself. Cross Strategic occupied half a floor in a building on Lexington. It was a decent office, good conference rooms, natural light, the kind of layout that suggested competence without suggesting excess. On a Sunday, it was empty except for the weekend security and one of the junior analysts who apparently had no distinction between weekday and weekend, a young man named Theo, who was always there when Damien arrived early and always there when he left late, and who looked up from his monitor with the mild surprise of someone who hadn't expected company. "Mr. Cross," Theo said. "Working on anything urgent?" Damien asked. "The Meridian Analysis client review is Tuesday." Damien nodded and went to his office and sat down and looked at his desk. Patricia had left a note, an actual handwritten note, which was her preferred method of communicating anything she considered important enough not to bury in email. It was dated Friday, 2 days ago. D. Heard about Caldwell officially. We need to talk this week. Not about crisis management, about what comes next. P. He set the note down and looked at his office. The framed industry certifications on the wall. The clean desk that was clean because he'd become somewhat ceremonial about keeping it that way. The view of Lexington through the window, ordinary, mid-level, the view of a successful consulting firm that had been coasting on its success for too long. He picked up his phone and called Patricia. She answered on the second ring, which meant she'd been expecting it. "You're in the office," she said. Not a question. "Yeah, you saw the note I left. You left." He stopped. "I got your note." "I figured." A pause. "How was Connecticut?" He told her he was going to a wedding in Connecticut. He hadn't told her whose wedding. "Instructive," he said. A brief silence on her end that held a kind of patience he recognized. The particular patience of someone who'd been waiting for a specific conversation and was willing to wait a little longer. "Tuesday," she said, "not as a crisis meeting. I want to go through the restructuring proposal properly. The whole thing. Everything I gave you in April." "I read it this morning," he said. Another silence, this one slightly different in texture. "How did it read?" she asked. "Like something I should have implemented in April," he said. A pause. "Okay," she said, with the careful restraint of someone who has enough professionalism not to say "I told you so," but enough honesty not to pretend it doesn't apply. "Tuesday then, 9 o'clock. "Tuesday," he confirmed. He hung up and sat in his office for a while doing nothing in particular, which was its own kind of discipline, sitting with the shape of the problem without immediately trying to fix it, or reframe it, or locate the narrative in which it was someone else's fault. The call from his attorney came Monday afternoon. He was in a review meeting with 2 clients, a freight forwarding company that had been with Cross Strategic for 4 years, and was, mercifully, still satisfied, largely because Patricia had personally managed the relationship, when his phone lit up with Martin Geller's name. He let it go to voicemail, finished the meeting, walked his clients to the elevator with the professional warmth of someone who understood that intact relationships now required more care than he'd been giving them. He called Martin back from his office with the door closed. "There's something you need to know about," Martin said. He used the tone he used when something was serious enough that the pleasantries were beside the point. "Tell me," Damien said. "I got a call this morning from a contact at the SEC's Enforcement Division." A pause. "They're running an investigation, financial fraud, specifically related to the Hargrove Energy engagement." Hargrove Energy was the energy sector client, the one that had consumed 18 months of resources and delivered mediocre results and quietly declined to expand 3 months ago. Damien felt the air in the room change. "What kind of fraud?" he said. "The specifics are still developing," Martin said, "but it centers on billing irregularities and misrepresentation of deliverables. Someone inside Hargrove flagged it to their board. The board brought it to the SEC. He paused. "Damien, the investigation covers the full term of the engagement. Cross Strategic's billing records are going to be part of the review." Damien pressed his fingers to his temple. "When did this start?" "The formal investigation was opened 6 weeks ago. My contact reached out as a courtesy. The standard notification process hasn't come through yet, but it will, likely within the next 2 to 3 weeks. Are we talking about—" He stopped, started again. "Am I personally—" "You're the principal of the firm," Martin said. "Yes. You're in the scope." He leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling, the industry certifications on the wall, the clean desk, the Lexington view. The Hargrove engagement had been pitched to him by a business development contact 18 months ago as a significant opportunity. A major energy company expanding its logistics infrastructure, generous contract terms, a chance to establish cross-strategic in a new sector. He'd approved the engagement enthusiastically, assigned a team, and largely delegated the operational management to a senior consultant named Reed Sutter, who had a track record in energy sector work and had seemed like the right fit. He'd checked in quarterly. The numbers had looked acceptable. Not spectacular, but acceptable. He'd been managing too many things at once. The way you manage too many things when you're trying to maintain a revenue level your company's actual performance no longer justifies. He was now understanding with the cold clarity of retrospect, looked closely enough at how those numbers had been generated. Reed Sutter, he said. His name is in the preliminary documentation, Martin confirmed. He's likely to be a primary focus. But given that you were the principal signatory on the billing agreements, I know, Damien said. I need to see everything, Martin said. The full engagement file, billing records, deliverable documentation, all internal communications. This week. You'll have it, Damien said. He hung up and sat in his office in the specific stillness of a man who has just watched the remaining scaffolding give way. He thought about calling someone. He went through the list of people he might call in this situation. Not the lawyer, he'd just spoken to Martin, and not Patricia, not yet, not before he understood the full shape of it. He thought about old friends, the kind of friends you accumulate over 2 decades of professional life, who know your name and your history, and with whom you share enough context to speak plainly. The list was shorter than it should have been. He'd been the kind of man who maintained relationships transactionally, who kept people close when they were useful and allowed distance to grow when they weren't. He told himself it was just the natural attrition of adult life, the way friendships thin as careers thicken. But sitting in his office on a Monday afternoon with a federal investigation opening around him and the Caldwell contract gone, and his fiancée's 2-word text from Saturday night, the last communication between them, the real accounting of the thing was hard to avoid. He'd invested in surfaces, in the visible architecture of a successful life, the right apartment, the right woman, the right clients, the right number of scotches, at the right kind of weddings. He'd spent so much energy on the appearance of building something that he hadn't fully noticed when the thing itself had started to hollow out. He opened his email and found the thread with Reed Sutter's quarterly reports from the Hargrove engagement. He read them with different eyes than he'd used the first time. The numbers, viewed now with the specific paranoia of a man looking for what he'd missed, had a particular quality. Too clean in places where real numbers aren't clean, too consistent in places where real performance is variable. The deliverable summaries were written with the vague confidence of documents that were designed to satisfy a cursory review rather than bear actual scrutiny. He'd given them a cursory review. Of course he had. He'd been busy. He'd been running a company on reputation and momentum and the deep structural conviction that things were basically fine. He called Reed Sutter's mobile number. It went immediately to voicemail. He called twice more. Same result. He sent an email marked urgent and copied Martin. Then he sat back and understood, without needing it confirmed, that Reed Sutter was already managing his own exposure and was not going to be easy to reach. He was going to need to understand exactly what had happened inside that engagement. He was going to need to establish clearly and documentably the line between what he'd authorized and what he'd been unaware of. And he was going to need to do it before the formal notification from the SEC arrived and the timeline compressed. He picked up his phone and called Martin back. "I need to meet tomorrow," he said. "First thing." "My office, 8 o'clock, Martin said, without hesitation. He'd been expecting it. Tuesday came with the particular blankness of days that are going to matter. Damien was in Martin's office on Park Avenue by 8:15. The building was one of those old New York law firm addresses that communicated stability and longevity through the sheer weight of its fixtures, the kind of place where bad news was delivered in rooms that had absorbed a great deal of it and remained standing. Martin was thorough. He always had been. It was why Damien had used him for 15 years, through business formations and contract disputes, and the divorce proceedings, and now this, which was by far the most serious thing Martin had ever been required to manage on his behalf. They went through the Hargrove file for 3 hours. Martin's 2 associates joined after the first hour, bringing their own annotated copies of documents Damien hadn't known they'd already obtained. The picture that assembled itself was not as bad as it could have been. Damien's direct involvement in the specific irregularities appeared limited, The documentation suggested they originated within Reed Sutter's operational management of the engagement, but it was bad enough. The principal of the firm had signed the billing agreements. The firm bore liability for deliverables that appeared not to have been delivered. Best case, Martin said, at the end of the third hour, with the measured directness of a lawyer who understood that optimism was a tool to be used carefully. This is a civil matter, restitution, penalties, potentially a consent decree with some operating restrictions. The SEC distinguishes between fraud perpetrated by a firm and fraud perpetrated within a firm without sufficient oversight. And worst case, Damien said. Martin looked at him. Worst case, the distinction doesn't hold and the personal liability question becomes more serious. A pause. Which is why we're going to make very sure the distinction holds. Damien nodded. He left Martin's office at noon and stood on Park Avenue in the pale October light and called Patricia. I need to postpone the 9 o'clock from this morning, he said. Something came up. A silence. The Hargrove investigation, she said. He stopped walking. How do you know about that? Because Reed Sutter's assistant called our office this morning asking for documentation that should have been filed months ago, Patricia said, with the controlled calm of someone who has been expecting this and is choosing not to be dramatic about it. I put it together from there. I've been in this industry for 20 years, Damien. I know what that kind of document request means. He leaned against the wall of a building on Park Avenue and looked at the street. Taxis. Pedestrians. The ordinary Tuesday momentum of a city that had no particular interest in his problems. How bad is it? She asked. It's manageable, he said, and then stopped himself because manageable was the word he'd been using for 2 years about things that had not in fact been managed. I don't know yet, he said instead. It depends on what the documentation shows. Okay, she said. Patricia. He paused. I'm sorry I didn't move fast on your proposal. A silence that was a very specific kind of silence. The kind that belongs to someone who has been right for a long time and is now being acknowledged and has enough grace not to make a production of it. We'll get through the restructuring, she said. Whatever the legal situation looks like, the company's operational problems are fixable. The Caldwell loss hurts, but it's not unsurvivable if we make the right moves now. She paused. I just need you to actually be in the room this time. I'll be in the room, he said. Good, she said, and hung up with the efficiency of someone who had a list of things to do and was returning to it. The press item appeared on Wednesday. It was brief. A trade publication notice, 2 paragraphs, the kind of thing that circulated in industry circles rather than mainstream news. SEC opens inquiry into cross-strategic consulting's Hargrove Energy engagement. Enough detail to be accurate, not enough to be sensational, but in the specific connected ecosystem of New York consulting and logistics, 2 paragraphs was sufficient. By Wednesday afternoon, Damien had received 3 calls from clients asking for clarification and 1 email from a prospective client quietly withdrawing from a conversation they'd been having about an engagement. He took the client calls personally. He was honest, more honest than his instincts wanted him to be, because his instincts were still calibrated toward managed messaging, and his instincts had not been serving him well. He told them the investigation was in its early stages, that Cross-Strategic was cooperating fully, that the specific irregularities under review appeared to originate within a single engagement managed by a consultant who was no longer with the firm, and that he was personally committed to full transparency through the process. 2 of the 3 clients said they appreciated the directness. The third asked him to call back in 2 weeks, which was a softer version of the same thing the prospective client had communicated by email. He made the calls standing at his office window, looking out at Lexington, and when they were done, he sat back down and felt the specific weight of consequences that had been accumulating for a long time and were now, all at once, present. The same afternoon, he received a call from Owen Marsh, no relation to Rosalind, a former business partner who ran a mid-sized logistics consulting firm in Boston. Owen was one of the people from Damien's professional past who fell into the category of genuine rather than transactional. They'd collaborated on 2 projects years ago, competed occasionally since, and maintained the kind of relationship that was honest without being close. Heard about the Hargrove situation, Owen said, with the directness of someone who skipped preamble on principle. How are you doing with it? Managing, Damien said. Then, because Owen would see through it anyway, it's serious. Yeah. A pause. Listen, I'm going to tell you something that you're not going to love, and I'm telling you because we've known each other long enough that I think you'd rather hear it than not. Go ahead. The Caldwell contract, Owen said. My firm picked it up. Damien was quiet for a moment. When? Letter of intent signed last week. Full contract execution pending, but it's effectively done. Owen said it evenly. Not with triumph, not with apology, just as a fact. I'm not calling to rub it in. I'm calling because I think you should know, and I think you should know how it happened. Tell me. Blackwell Global's infrastructure division reached out to 4 firms, Owen said, including yours, which was already in the system as the incumbent. Standard competitive review. They sent the same performance benchmarks to all 4. Your numbers were the weakest in the pool. My firms were the strongest. The decision was, genuinely, just math. A pause. There was no animus, no steering. The person who ran the review didn't show any particular interest in who won, only in who met the standard. Damien thought about what Gerald Park had said at the wedding. The same conclusion, from 2 different angles. I know, he said. I figured that out at the wedding. The wedding, Owen repeated with a slight shift in his voice. You were there? Long story. Owen was quiet for a moment. Damien, I've been watching your firm for a while, the way you watch someone you've competed with. The last 2 years, you know what I noticed? Tell me. You stopped hiring people who were smarter than you, Owen said. That's the thing I see happen to firms that start coasting. The principals stop being uncomfortable. They stop bringing in people who challenge the way they're doing things. And for a year, maybe 2, it looks fine. Revenue holds, clients don't immediately leave. And then it compounds. He paused. Patricia Howe is still there, right? She is. She's the smartest person in your organization. Has been for years, from what I can tell. Owen said it without decoration. If she's still there, you have something to work with. After he hung up, Damien sat with Owen's words for a while, in the particular quiet of a man who's been given something accurate and is deciding what to do with it. Patricia, who had given him a restructuring proposal in April that he'd failed to implement, who had called him the moment she understood the Hargrove situation, who had been managing relationships he'd allowed to become secondary while he'd been occupied with the performance of running a company rather than the actual practice of it. He'd done what he'd always done, surrounded himself with people who could execute and then taken the credit for their execution without fully acknowledging, to them or to himself, how much of the company's real functioning depended on them rather than on him. He'd done it in his marriage, too. The recognition of that parallel arrived quietly, without the drama it perhaps deserved. Just a slow, settling understanding of a pattern that had been consistent across the full length of his adult life. The consistent underestimation of what other people were contributing, because he'd been too busy maintaining his version of events to look at what was actually there. Vivian writing a restructuring proposal for a logistics company that had gone under 4 years later. Vivian presenting at international conferences without notes. Vivian quietly, systematically building a career that had been trying to become itself for years before the space to do it existed. The space he'd occupied. Not maliciously, just thoughtlessly, which turned out to be the same thing in practical terms. Wednesday evening, he was closing up the office when Cassandra called. He answered because not answering felt like a different kind of avoidance than the ones he was trying to stop practicing. Hey, she said. Hey. A pause. I wanted to check in. I heard about the SEC thing. It travels fast. It does. Another pause. Are you okay? He thought about the question honestly, which was something he was making an effort to do more consistently. Not particularly, he said, but I'll be all right. I think so too, she said, and he heard in it the particular tone of someone who is saying goodbye to something without saying the word. I'm going to take some time, she said, figure out what I want from the next part of things. With Fletcher Cole, he said. A pause. Maybe, she said, with the honesty that had always been one of her best qualities. I don't know yet, but separately from that, I've been doing my own accounting this week. About what I want and what I've been telling myself I want, and they're not as close as I thought. Yeah, he said, I know what that's like. I'm sorry about the company, she said, and she meant it. Her voice had the specific quality of genuine regret rather than politeness. I'm sorry about a lot of it. Me too, he said. They said goodbye with the mutual, slightly bruised decency of 2 people who had never been quite right for each other and were at least leaving it honestly. He put his phone in his pocket, turned off his office light, and walked through the empty office. Past Theo's desk, where Theo had apparently finally gone home, past the conference rooms with their whiteboards still half covered from Monday's meetings, past the reception desk where a plant Patricia had put there 3 years ago was still alive because Patricia watered it on Fridays. He took the elevator down to the lobby. He walked out onto Lexington Avenue into the Wednesday night of a city that was, as always, entirely indifferent to any individual's specific gravity, and he stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the cool air and looked at the street. A federal investigation, the loss of his largest client, his engagement dissolved by mutual unspoken agreement, his company hollowed by 2 years of mismanagement he'd called strategy. All of it visible now, the way things become visible when you stop looking at them through the specific distortion of your own preferred story. He started walking. He had Patricia on Tuesday mornings and Martin on Thursday afternoons, and a company that was damaged but not, as Patricia had said, unsurvivable if the right moves were made now. He had the full and accurate knowledge of exactly how he'd gotten here, which was not comfortable but was, as Vivian had said in a different context, useful. He had a long way back. He walked north on Lexington with his hands in his pockets, in the ordinary darkness of a Wednesday in October, and let the city's noise fill the space where his certainties used to be. The long way back turned out to be longer than he'd expected. That was the thing about genuine reckoning. It didn't arrive all at once, clean and complete, the way it did in the version of events you told yourself afterward. It arrived in installments. Tuesdays with Patricia going through restructuring plans that were harder to implement than they'd been to write. Thursday afternoons with Martin parsing the boundaries of civil liability with the careful language of a man who understood that precision in these conversations was the difference between recoverable and not. Monday mornings when Damien looked at the client roster and did the arithmetic on what was left versus what was needed, and the numbers required honest interpretation rather than optimistic rounding. November came and the investigation formalized. The SEC notification arrived on a Tuesday, 8 days after Martin had predicted it, and it was every bit as serious in its official form as it had been in the preliminary conversations. Cross Strategic Consulting was named as a respondent in a civil enforcement action related to the Hargrove Energy engagement. Reed Sutter was named separately and more prominently. The documentation, once fully examined, established clearly that the specific billing irregularities had originated within his operational management of the engagement. But the firm bore liability for insufficient oversight, and Damien bore liability as its principal, and the process of establishing exactly where those liabilities began and ended was going to take the better part of a year and cost more than he wanted to calculate. He told Patricia the morning the notification arrived. She was sitting across from him in the conference room they'd been using for restructuring sessions. A whiteboard behind her covered in the organizational charts and revenue projections they'd been working through for 3 weeks. She listened to the full summary without interrupting, which was how she always listened to things she was going to have an opinion about. "Will it affect client retention?" she asked when he finished. "Some," he said. "We've already lost 2 conversations. The clients we've spoken to directly seem to be holding, for now." "Then we keep talking to them directly," she said, "every week if necessary. They need to hear from you, not from the press." She looked at the whiteboard. "The restructuring continues." "Patricia." "The restructuring continues," she said again, with the particular firmness of someone who has decided that the only useful response to a complicated situation is forward motion. "We can't fix the investigation. Martin can fix the investigation. What we can fix is the company, and we do that by fixing the company." She picked up her marker. "Now, the Dalton account. Where are we on the service review?" He looked at her for a moment. This woman who had been doing the real work of keeping cross-strategic functional for years while he'd been managing his own narrative, and felt something that was not quite gratitude and not quite shame, but lived in the territory between them. "The Dalton review is Thursday," he said. "Then let's make sure Thursday goes well," she said, and turned back to the whiteboard. What? December arrived, and with it the particular quality of a New York winter that strips everything back to its essential character. The city became functional rather than decorative. People moving with purpose rather than leisure, the social architecture of the warmer months, replaced by the more pragmatic rhythms of a city that didn't stop for weather. The restructuring was taking shape, slowly, imperfectly, with the specific friction of any process that requires an organization to look honestly at what it's been doing wrong. 2 more clients had quietly departed in November. 3 had renewed on terms that were slightly less favorable than before, which Damien accepted without negotiating hard, because keeping the relationship was worth more than winning the negotiation. Patricia had brought in a senior analyst, a woman named Diana Cho, who had 15 years of experience and the kind of methodical intelligence that Damien recognized, with the specific discomfort of recognition as the thing he'd been systematically not hiring for the last several years. Diana had been in the office for 3 weeks when she presented an analysis of Cross-Strategic's operational gaps that was so accurate it was briefly difficult to read. He'd thanked her and meant it. He was practicing meaning things, he said. It was harder than it sounded when you'd spent years in the habit of performing sincerity rather than exercising it. The SEC process moved at its own pace, which was slow and relentless. Martin managed it with the thoroughness Damien paid him for. By December, the picture was clear enough. This was going to be a civil matter, not criminal. Restitution to Hargrove Energy for the billing irregularities, significant penalties. Consent decree with operational compliance requirements for 3 years. Damien's personal liability was limited by the documentation establishing that the specific fraud had been Sutter's. But the oversight failures were his, and the consequences of those failures were real and would remain real for some time. He paid the restitution in January. It came from his personal reserves, which were sufficient but not comfortable after the payment. He signed the consent decree. He cooperated with the compliance review. He did all of it without the narrative management he would have applied to any difficult situation in his previous life, without the careful framing designed to make it look like something other than what it was. What it was a man who had not been paying close enough attention to what was happening inside his own organization, and whose company and clients had paid for that inattention. He said that, more or less in those words, in a statement he released in January. His PR instincts had initially drafted something more managed, more layered with context and mitigation. He'd read it, deleted it, and written the shorter, more honest version. Martin had said it was probably strategically wise. Patricia had said it was the right thing to do and left those two categories pointedly uncombined. Spring came the way. Spring comes in New York. Gradually, then suddenly, the city shifting from gray functionality to the tentative warmth of a place remembering what it looked like in better light. Cross-Strategic was smaller than it had been a year ago. That was simply the arithmetic of the situation. Fewer clients, a leaner staff, a revenue base that required rebuilding rather than maintenance. But the organization that remained was, Damien was beginning to understand, more honest than the one it had replaced. The clients who'd stayed had stayed because the work was actually good. Diana Cho had taken ownership of 2 major accounts and was performing at a level that made Damien aware, with useful regularity, of the gap between her capacity and his previous hiring standards. Patricia had restructured the business development function in a way that was already generating new conversations, smaller, more targeted, less about the Cross-Strategic name, and more about what the work actually produced. It was not triumphant. It was not a comeback story. Not yet, possibly not ever in the form he'd have preferred. It was just work, the steady, unglamorous practice of building something real instead of managing the appearance of something real. He showed up. He paid attention. He asked the questions he'd been too proud to ask before, and he listened to the answers without immediately redirecting them to confirm what he already believed. He was getting better at it, some days more than others. Vivian answered with the quality he'd watched all evening at Harrowfield, directly, without hedging, with the specific confidence of someone who knew the subject not as theory, but as practical experience measured in actual outcomes. She used numbers where numbers were the clearest answer. She used plain language where plain language was more accurate than the technical version. She paused when the question required thought, rather than filling the pause with noise. She was wearing a jacket he didn't recognize over what appeared to be a simple dark dress. Her hair was down. She looked, he thought, like herself. Not a performance of success, not the careful self-presentation of someone managing their image. Just herself, doing what she did, in front of a camera that happened to be there. The interviewer shifted. "Your scholarship program," she said. "The Heart Initiative. Tell me about that." Vivian's expression changed slightly. Not more formal, but more present. Like the subject engaged something different in her than the logistics questions had. "It started from something pretty simple," Vivian said. "I spent a long time in workplaces where I was told, not always directly, sometimes just structurally, that the ideas I had were less valuable than they actually were, and I had the resources to change that for other people. So I did." A pause. The Heart Initiative provides scholarships and mentorship to women in supply chain and logistics who are early or mid-career. People who have the ability, but not always the access. "How many recipients in the first year?" 47, Vivian said. We're expanding to 80 in the second cohort. That's significant. It's a start, Vivian said, not falsely modest, just accurate. Like someone who understood the scope of what was needed and wasn't going to pretend 47 was sufficient. The interviewer leaned slightly forward. A lot of people in your position, having achieved what you've achieved, spend time talking about the path, the journey. She said it with the light irony of someone who'd heard the word journey one too many times. You tend not to do that. Why? Vivian considered. She had the look she'd always had when she was forming an actual answer rather than a performative one. Because the past isn't where I live, she said. It happened, and some of it was hard, and it made me into someone who could do the work I do now. But spending a lot of time narrating it, processing it publicly, organizing it into lessons. I don't know. It feels like standing in a doorway. She paused. I'd rather be in the room. The interviewer nodded. People who doubted you, she said. And there were people who doubted you. Vivian looked at the interviewer with a slight shift in her expression, the specific look of someone deciding how honest to be. There were, she said. Any message for them? A pause. Not a long one, but genuine. The pause of someone who had an answer and was checking whether it was the right one to give. No, Vivian said simply. I don't think about them enough to have a message for them. A beat. That's not unkind. It's just true. My future is too good to spend on old wounds. Damien paused the stream. He sat in his office on a Tuesday evening in April, the city busy outside his window, and looked at the frozen frame on his screen. Vivian mid-sentence, composed, clear-eyed, entirely at home in her own life. My future is too good to spend on old wounds. He thought about the October night he'd driven back from Connecticut with the radio off and the weight of the evening's accounting settling into him. He thought about the months since, the investigation, the consent decree, the smaller company, the longer days. The specific, unglamorous work of trying to become someone whose judgments could be trusted, including by himself. He thought about what Vivian had said on the terrace. I feel like I'm talking to someone I used to know. The version of himself he'd been that night. The man who'd sent that wedding invitation with a satisfied smirk and driven out to Greenwich to let his ex-wife see what she'd given up, was genuinely someone he used to know. Not gone, not erased, but sufficiently distant that he could examine him with something approaching objectivity. That man had been so certain about his trajectory, his judgment, his correct reading of other people's limitations. He'd worn that certainty like infrastructure, built everything on top of it, never seriously questioned the foundation. The foundation had been wrong about almost everything that mattered. He unplugged his earbuds and closed the laptop and sat for a while in the quiet of the office. In the particular stillness of a man sitting with the full truth of something rather than a managed version of it. He had not lost Vivian to Adrian Blackwell. He had lost her to the much simpler and much harder truth that he had never fully seen her, had looked at her for 7 years with the specific blindness of a man who'd already decided what she was, and in doing so had missed, comprehensively, what she actually was. The talent, the precision, the patience that was never passivity, but always choice. The capacity that had been developing the entire length of their marriage, quietly, in the margins of a life he'd organized around his own priorities. He hadn't driven her away through cruelty. He'd simply taken up all the space, not deliberately, just consistently, with the confident selfishness of a person who'd never been required to notice how much room he was occupying. And she had, in the quiet, undramatic way that had always been her actual nature, waited until she had enough room, and then become fully and completely herself. He called Patricia the next morning to tell her about the Diana Cho development. Diana had been approached by a competitor and had, somewhat to Damien's surprise, turned down the offer. He'd found out from Theo, who found out from someone in accounting, the way information always moved in offices regardless of how many official channels existed. She turned it down, he said. She told me, Patricia said, with the slight satisfaction of someone who had known something before being told it. She said the work here is more interesting than what they were offering. What were they offering? More money, Patricia said, but a smaller scope. A pause. She wants to build things, Damien. She doesn't just want to manage what's already built. Another pause, with a quality that was deliberate. Most people who are genuinely good at something want to do the thing. They don't just want the title for the thing. He heard it. He was getting better at hearing the things Patricia said that were about more than the immediate subject. I know, he said. Good, she said. Shall we talk about the Ashford proposal? I want to review your section before Thursday. Send it to me, he said. I'll have notes by end of day. He had notes by 3 o'clock. Actual, substantive notes, the kind that required him to read the proposal carefully rather than scan it for the headline numbers. Diana had written most of it. His notes were mostly additions rather than corrections, which was the right ratio for a document produced by someone who knew what they were doing. He was getting better at that too. Summer came, and with it the particular rhythm of a city operating at partial capacity, the vacations, the quieter offices, the sense of a place that had agreed collectively to conduct its more serious business in other months. Cross Strategic's recovery was real but not dramatic. They'd won 3 new clients in the second quarter, all of them smaller than the company's former flagship accounts, all of them relationships built on specific, demonstrable work rather than reputation. The revenue trajectory was pointed in the right direction. The consent decree compliance was proceeding without incident. Martin reported quarterly with the careful optimism of a lawyer who had learned not to declare victory prematurely. Damien sold the Midtown apartment in June, not because he had to. The finances, while constrained, were not desperate, but because living in a space that had been architected as a performance of a particular identity felt, by the middle of his second year of trying to be a different kind of person, actively counterproductive. He moved to a smaller place in Brooklyn, a third-floor walk-up in a neighborhood that was neither aspirational nor neglected, just functional and specific and genuinely itself. He liked it more than he'd expected. The building had a quality of honest use to it. Scuffed staircase, neighbors who knew each other's names without knowing each other's incomes, that the Midtown apartment had never had. He was learning, slowly and somewhat against his instincts, to prefer honest things over impressive ones. He was learning to tell the difference. He thought about Vivian sometimes, not with longing, not with regret, in the consuming form that would have been its own kind of self-indulgence, but with the specific quality of someone thinking about a lesson that had been genuinely costly. He thought about the word ordinary, and how confidently he'd held it, and how thoroughly it had been wrong. He thought about the dinner conversation he couldn't remember, the proposal she'd worked on for 3 months, the way she'd said, "All right, Damien," and gone to make coffee. He thought about what it cost to be consistently underestimated by the person who is supposed to know you best. Not the dramatic cost of overt cruelty, but the quieter, more persistent cost of a partner who simply doesn't look. Doesn't ask the second question. Doesn't notice when you've done something that deserved to be noticed. He hadn't understood, when he was inside the marriage, that there was anything to notice. He'd organized his understanding of Vivian so completely around his prior assumptions that new information hadn't found any purchase. She'd tried, he suspected, tried in the indirect ways of someone who had learned not to insist, and he'd nodded and refilled his glass and moved on to whatever was happening in his own world. That was the part he carried. Not guilt in the theatrical form, not the self-flagellating loop that was really just another kind of self-involvement, just the steady, useful knowledge of a specific failure of attention and the determination to apply that knowledge forward. He was better at asking questions now. Not just at work, with people generally. He caught himself more often in the habit of listening to respond rather than listening to understand, and he interrupted the habit with increasing regularity. I was imperfect at it. He was imperfect at most of the things he was trying to change, which was apparently how change worked when it was real rather than performed. Theo had told him, once, with the guileless directness of someone who hadn't yet learned to be diplomatic about observations, that he seemed different than when Theo had first started working there. Different how? Damien had asked. Theo had thought about it with the seriousness he brought to most things. Like you're actually here, he'd said. Before, it felt like you were somewhere else a lot of the time, like you were in a meeting about the meeting or something. He'd shrugged. Now you're just here. Damien had looked at him for a moment. Thank you, Theo, he'd said. I'm not sure if it's a compliment, Theo had said honestly. It is, Damien had said. Take it. Yes. In August, 14 months after the wedding, he received a note. Not an email, a handwritten note. Note, which was sufficiently rare that its arrival in the cross-strategic mailroom had generated mild curiosity before it reached his desk. The envelope was plain, his name written in the unfussy, precise hand he recognized immediately. Inside was a single card, cream-colored, with 4 sentences written in the same hand. I heard the restructuring is going well. Patricia Howe told someone who told someone, as these things travel. I wanted you to know I was glad to hear it. Take care of yourself, Damien. No signature. None was necessary. He sat at his desk and read it twice. He thought about writing back. He thought about what he would say, and went through several versions in his head, grateful, reflective, honest, about everything he'd understood since October. He drafted 3 sentences before he understood, with the specific clarity of someone who has gotten better at knowing the right thing, that writing back was not the right thing. The note was not an opening. It was a closing, a generous, final closing, from someone who had enough largeness of spirit to wish him well without owing him anything, and who had communicated everything worth communicating in 4 sentences, because she'd always known the right amount to say. He put the note in the top drawer of his desk. He picked up the phone and called Patricia. "Tell me where we are on the Ashford follow-up," he said. "Diana sent the supplemental analysis this morning," Patricia said. "It's good work." "I'll read it before noon," he said. Can we meet at 2? "I'll book the room," she said. He put down the phone and looked at his desk. Not the carefully curated desk of the man who'd stood in Adrian Blackwell's forecourt, feeling superior to his own history, but the working desk of a man who was doing the actual work, with the actual tools available to him, in the actual present tense of a life that had stopped being managed and started being lived. Outside his window, New York in August was its loud, impractical, completely itself self. The heat, the noise, the particular energy of a city that contained too many people with too many urgent concerns to be polite about any of them. He had a meeting at 2. He had a proposal to read before noon. He had a company that was smaller than it had been and more honest than it had ever been, and a long road still ahead, and no particular certainty about where it went. There were worse places to be. He'd been in a worse place. He'd been in the place of complete certainty, certain about his trajectory, his worth, his reading of other people, his right to define what mattered and what didn't. That place had looked like success from the inside and had been, from any useful external vantage point, a room with no windows and a man inside it who'd convinced himself the walls were horizons. The room had broken open 18 months ago on a Saturday in Connecticut, in a forecourt full of valets and a tent full of people whose names he hadn't known, at the wedding of the woman he'd dismissed as ordinary, in the house of the man she'd chosen, in the life she'd built in the space he'd vacated. He hadn't thanked her for it. He wouldn't. That wasn't what the note was for, and it wasn't what any of this was for. Some reckonings don't come with a recipient. Some things you understand too late to address. And the only honest thing to do with them is carry them forward, carefully, and let them change how you move through the next part. He opened Diana's analysis and started reading from the beginning. He read every word. He was still learning how. He read Diana's analysis twice. The first time through, he moved at the pace he'd trained himself to use for documents that deserved actual attention. Slow enough to absorb the argument rather than just the conclusions. Slow enough to notice where the reasoning was strong and where it assumed things that should be tested. The second time, he made notes in the margin of the printed copy, the old-fashioned way Patricia preferred, and that he'd adopted because it turned out that putting a pen to paper slowed him down in ways that were useful. Diana had done something he hadn't expected. Beyond the operational analysis, the freight modeling, the cost projections, the competitive positioning work he'd asked for, she'd included a final section that wasn't in the brief. It was titled simply Structural Considerations, and it laid out, with the methodical clarity that was her signature, a 3-year development pathway for cross-strategic that started from where the company actually was, rather than where it wished it were. It was, he thought, not unlike the proposal Patricia had written in April of the previous year, the one he hadn't read carefully enough. Except this one had more data, a sharper sense of the market, and the specific perspective of someone who joined the company at its low point and understood from direct experience what the rebuild actually required. He wrote in the margin, "Let's talk about this separately. This is the conversation." He set the printed pages down and looked out the window for a moment. August in Brooklyn was different from August in Midtown. Noisier in some ways because the neighborhood was dense and the windows in his apartment were old enough to let sound through, but also more honest somehow. The sounds were the sounds of people actually living rather than the sounds of a city performing its own significance. He thought about something Rosalind Marsh had said at Harrowfield, in the amber light of the bar, with her glass of sparkling water and her direct, precise delivery. I wonder if that's because she wasn't ambitious, or because nobody was asking. He'd filed it away that night in the specific drawer of things he wasn't quite ready to fully receive. He'd opened that drawer many times since. Nobody was asking. That was the thing he kept returning to. He'd built an entire understanding of Vivian around the fact that she hadn't insisted, hadn't pushed for recognition, hadn't demanded that he pay attention, hadn't made her abilities loud enough to penetrate the comfortable noise of his own self-regard. He'd read that quietness as limitation when it had been simply the character of someone who didn't perform for audiences that weren't paying attention. She'd known what she was capable of. She hadn't needed him to confirm it. And he had mistaken that self-sufficiency, that profound rooted absence of need for his validation, for smallness. He understood now that it was the opposite, that the people who most need others to acknowledge their worth are often the people least certain of it, and that the people who carry their worth quietly, without display, without requiring a witness, are usually the ones who actually have it. I was still learning to be the kind of person who noticed that difference. The 2 o'clock meeting with Patricia ran long, the way meetings run when they're about something real. They went through the Ashford proposal section by section, and he asked questions he wouldn't have asked a year ago. Not the questions of someone managing a narrative, but the questions of someone trying to understand a problem well enough to actually solve it. Patricia answered with the patient specificity of someone who had been waiting, for longer than was fair, to have this quality of conversation with the person whose name was on the door. Near the end of the meeting, she said something that stayed with him. "You know what's different about this version of the pitch?" she said, tapping the proposal. "It doesn't oversell. Every other version we've done in the last 5 years has oversold, promised more certainty than the work could deliver, more speed than the process allowed." She looked at him. "This one just says what we're actually going to do, and somehow that's more convincing." "Honest things usually are," he said. Patricia looked at him with the expression of someone who had heard a person say a true thing and was deciding whether to point out that they hadn't always believed it. She decided not to. That was another one of her qualities he'd learned to value. She knew when a point had already been made. The meeting ended at 4:15. He walked back to his office, picked up Diana's analysis, and reread the structural section one more time. Then he wrote a message to both Patricia and Diana asking if they could meet Thursday morning to talk about a 3-year plan. Not the crisis management version, not the recovery narrative, but an actual plan, built from the ground up, starting from what was true. He sent the message and closed his laptop. He sat in the quiet of his office in the late afternoon light, with the city doing its ordinary and different work outside, and he felt something that was not happiness exactly. Happiness was too simple a word for the specific, complicated quality of a man who had lost a great deal and was building something smaller and more durable in its place. What he felt was closer to steadiness, the particular groundedness of someone who has stopped pretending and found, in the absence of pretense, an actual foundation. It wasn't where he'd planned to be at 41, but it was, for the first time in a long time, genuinely where he was. And that he was learning was the only place anything real could start.